The chocolate bar in your cupboard, the word shipshape, the first European footsteps in North America since the Vikings, all of it traces back to one mid-sized English city on a muddy tidal river. This is the complete history of Bristol, from its very first bridge to the year 2026. And somewhere inside it is the story of why, one summer Sunday, this city pulled one of its most honoured sons off his pedestal and rolled him into its own harbour. With AI trained on harbour charts, ship's manifests, and soot-stained photographs, we refloat the vanished centuries and sail you through them. Low tide around the year 1000. A river of grey mud winds between two low hills, and where the banks pinch closest together, someone has thrown a wooden bridge across. The water here is strange. The Severn estuary it feeds has the second highest tidal range on Earth, more than 40 feet between low water and high, so twice a day the river simply leaves, and twice a day it storms back in. Around that bridge, a Saxon trading town takes root, and they name it for the obvious thing. Brycgstow, the place of the bridge. People had watched this river far longer. Iron Age ramparts still crown the gorge downstream, and the Romans kept a small port nearby called Abona. But the city itself begins with those planks over the mud. The name did not survive contact with the locals. Bristolians have always added a soft L to words ending in a vowel. It still happens today, where an idea becomes an ideal. And over the centuries, their own accent sanded Brycgstow down into Bristol, a city that renamed itself purely by mispronouncing itself. I find that a very promising start. Its first trade was one it would spend centuries trying to forget. Saxon Bristol grew rich shipping English captives across to Ireland, men, women and children sold at this harbourside, until in the 1070s, an elderly bishop named Wulfstan of Worcester began coming down to the port to preach against it, sermon after sermon, year after year, until the merchants finally gave the trade up. One stubborn old man talking a market out of existence. Keep this chapter in mind. Bristol will need the lesson again. The Normans, arriving after 1066, understood at a glance what a bridge and a harbour were worth and raised a great stone castle over the town. In 1141, during England's grim civil war between Stephen and Matilda, that castle briefly held the most valuable houseguest in Europe, King Stephen himself, captured in battle and locked up in Bristol. For most of a year, whoever held this city effectively held the King of England, because they quite literally did, until he was traded back, king for captured earl, like the most expensive prisoner exchange of the age. Bristol had learned its own worth. The townsfolk, meanwhile, were busy doing something almost no medieval town dared. In the 1240s, they dug their river a new bed, hundreds of citizens carving a fresh channel for the Frome by hand to double their harbour. A public works project on a scale kings struggled to manage, paid for by shopkeepers. Trade answered. The bridge itself grew a 5-story street of shops and houses along its length, with a chapel rising in the middle of the river. Wine flooded in from Gascony until Bristol ran on Bordeaux, and the Spanish sweet wines landed in such quantity that sherry earned the affectionate local nickname Bristol Milk. A blend called Bristol Cream still carries this city's name into supermarkets on every continent. The port's ferocious tides taught its sailors a phrase the whole world still uses. At low water, ships here sat down hard on the mud, and any cargo loosely stowed went everywhere, so everything had to be lashed tight and seaworthy. Shipshape and Bristol fashion. The Great Pestilence of 1348 reached Bristol, among the first cities in England, carried straight off the ships, and in the worst months, the churchyards filled faster than the fonts. The city bent and did not break. By 1373, it had grown important enough that Edward III made it the first provincial town in England to become a county in its own right. Its richest merchant, William Canynges, poured a fortune into rebuilding the church of St. Mary Redcliffe into a red sandstone marvel. Elizabeth I is said to have later called it the fairest parish church in all England. And then, having buried 2 fortunes and a wife, Canynges gave it all up and ended his days as a quiet priest. Even Bristol's tycoons came with a twist. The twist that changed the world sailed on the 2nd of May, 1497. A Venetian navigator the English called John Cabot slipped down the Avon on the morning tide in a ship named the Matthew, a vessel so small that around 18 men crowded her deck, the gorge cliffs sliding past close enough to hear the gulls answering off the rock. 52 days out, through fog and pack ice and the long grey swell, and there it is, land. On the 24th of June, they wade ashore, plant the banners of England and Venice, and step where no European has stood since the Vikings 5 centuries before, the coast we now call Newfoundland. Columbus, at this point, was still bumping around the Caribbean. The mainland's modern story opens with a little Bristol ship. King Henry VII marked the finding of a continent with a reward of £10, quite possibly the stingiest bonus in recorded history, and Cabot sailed again the following year with 5 ships and vanished. Where the sea took him, historians argue to this day. To me, the quiet Venetian and his 18 men deserve at least half of Columbus's fame, and it has always slightly annoyed me that they never got it. If you're with me, tap the like for the crew of the Matthew. If you're Team Columbus, or one of you contrarians flying the flag for Leif Erikson, the comments are open for the great landfall argument. A replica of the Matthew sails Bristol's harbour today, and a tower on Brandon Hill has marked Cabot's voyage since the 400th anniversary. There is even a cherished local theory that America itself is named for Richard America, the Bristol customs officer who helped fund the voyages. The record, I should say, stands firmly with the mapmakers and Amerigo Vespucci, though I am not entirely convinced Bristol will ever accept that. Trade made the city swagger. Its merchants formed the Society of Merchant Venturers in 1552, and outside the exchange on Corn Street, they settled their deals in cash laid on 4 waist-high bronze pillars called nails, which is why, 5 centuries later, you still pay on the nail. The nails are still there. You can rest your coffee on the birthplace of an idiom. Swagger drew cannon fire. When England's civil war came in the 1640s, Bristol was the second city of the kingdom, and both sides wanted it desperately. Prince Rupert stormed it for the king in 1643. Fairfax and Cromwell took it back in 1645, and Rupert's surrender so enraged King Charles I that he dismissed his own nephew on the spot. Cromwell settled the question of Bristol Castle permanently. He had the entire fortress flattened in the 1650s, and today office workers eat lunch on the grass where the keep once stood. The sea kept sending Bristol strange gifts. In 1709, a Bristol privateer captain named Woodes Rogers, cruising the Pacific, answered a fire on an empty island and found a wild-bearded Scot named Alexander Selkirk, marooned there alone for 4 years and 4 months, the castaway whose story fed straight into Robinson Crusoe. Rogers wrote up the rescue, the book sold wildly, and within a decade, Daniel Defoe had turned Castaway into immortal legend. Tradition says a dockside Bristol pub, the Landager Trow, say it Landoger Trow, later helped inspire the pirate haunts of Treasure Island. And the most infamous pirate of them all, the man history calls Blackbeard, is widely believed to have been born right here in Bristol around 1680. Rogers, for his part, went on to govern the Bahamas and drive the pirates out of them, meaning this one city may have produced both the most famous pirate alive and the man who put piracy out of business. Bristol has always liked to hold both sides of a market, and that instinct is exactly where the story goes dark. In 1698, the London monopoly on African trade was broken, and Bristol's merchants moved in fast. Across the next century, more than 2,000 voyages left this harbour for the coast of West Africa, and Bristol ships carried over 500,000 enslaved African men, women and children across the Atlantic toward the plantations. 500,000 people. Some 20 sugar refineries steamed along the harbour, sweetening England's tea with plantation cane. The elegant squares, the gilded churches, the endowed schools of Georgian Bristol. Even the playhouse the city opened in 1766, which has never since gone dark and stands today as the Bristol Old Vic, the oldest continuously running theatre in the English-speaking world. A great deal of it was paid for out of that ledger, and no amount of beautiful brickwork will ever make it balance. 7 centuries after old Wulfstan shamed this same harbour out of one slave trade, the city built its golden age upon another. Among the merchants grown rich in that world was one Edward Colston, who gave so lavishly to Bristol's schools and charities that the city spent 200 years naming streets and halls for him, and in 1895 raised him a bronze statue in the centre of town. Remember that statue. The turning began in a pub. In 1787, a young investigator named Thomas Clarkson arrived in Bristol and sat night after night in the Seven Stars Tavern, quietly interviewing sailors by candlelight about what really happened on the ships, testimony that flowed straight into the abolition campaign, while a Bristol-born writer named Hannah More turned her formidable pen to the same cause, until Parliament outlawed the trade in 1807. The Seven Stars still pours pints today, an unassuming little building that helped turn history. Bristol's restless mind turned elsewhere too. A boy named Thomas Chatterton taught himself medieval script among the parchment chests of St. Mary Redcliffe and invented an entire 15th century poet, fooling half of literary London before his short life ended at 17. The Romantics never stopped grieving him. Coleridge and Southey schemed and lectured here, and in 1798, a Bristol bookseller published a slim volume called Lyrical Ballads. English Romantic poetry, as a physical book, was born in this city. In 1831, fury over a blocked reform bill boiled into 3 days of rioting that burned much of elegant Queen Square. A whole nation's demand for the vote, venting through Bristol first. The same restless year delivered the city its future in the shape of a 24-year-old engineer in a stovepipe hat. Isambard Kingdom Brunel won that year's competition to fling a bridge across the Avon Gorge, a single dizzying span between the cliffs. 24 years old. I still cannot quite believe the nerve of it. The money ran out, the bridge stalled, and Brunel moved on to stitch London to Bristol with his Great Western Railway, finished in 1841, its Temple Meads terminus among the oldest great railway buildings surviving anywhere. When a director grumbled that the line was already too long, Brunel is said to have suggested making it longer. Why not carry on to New York by steamship? People laughed. In 1838, his Great Western steamed from Bristol to New York and made the Atlantic a ferry crossing. He was only warming up. In 1843, with Prince Albert on hand and the harbour walls black with spectators, Brunel launched the Great Britain, the largest ship on Earth, the first ocean liner built of iron and driven by a screw propeller, the ancestor of every modern ship afloat. Hold on to her name. Her story is not finished. 4 years after that launch, in a Bristol factory, the family firm of Fry's pressed cocoa, sugar and cocoa butter into a mould and produced something nobody had ever sold before. The first mass-produced chocolate bar in the world, 1847, followed a generation later by Britain's first chocolate Easter egg. Every bar you have ever unwrapped descends from that Bristol workroom. Somebody in that room got the first bite of the first bar in history, and I have thought unreasonably hard about who it was. While the historians track that lucky soul down, give me the first chocolate bar of your life in the comments, the exact one that started it all for you. Mine involved a rainy car journey and no regrets. The Victorian city, though, was losing the race it had invented. The tides that gave Bristol its phrase were also slowly shutting its port down. Even a vast engineering fix in 1809, damming and locking the tide out of 80 acres of water to create the floating harbour, where ships at last stayed forever afloat, could not stop the biggest vessels drifting to Liverpool, and Brunel's own Great Britain ended the century abandoned as a storage hulk in the Falkland Islands, half the world away. New docks at the river's mouth, tobacco fortunes, and a young university kept the city moving. It also, in 1904, produced a boy named Archibald Leach, who ran off with a troupe of acrobats and came back to the world as Cary Grant, Hollywood's most elegant man, born over a Bristol shop. The night of the 24th of November, 1940, the sirens rose and enemy aircraft found the city. Through that winter, Bristol was one of the most heavily targeted cities in Britain. The medieval shopping heart around Castle Street burned in a single evening, and close to 1,300 Bristolians were lost before the raids ended. Churchill came days after the worst of it, awarding university degrees in his chancellor's robes while the surrounding streets still smoked. The roofless tower of St. Peter's stands in the grass of Castle Park today, kept exactly as the fire left it, as the city's quiet memorial. Rebuilding took hands from across the sea, and the Caribbean men and women who answered found a city that would take their labour, but not on its buses, their service. In 1963, the Bristol Omnibus Company was openly refusing to hire black or Asian crews, so a young youth worker named Paul Stevenson booked one immaculate candidate, Guy Bailey, an interview, watched it get cancelled the moment the company heard he was West Indian, and called a boycott of the entire bus network. For 4 months, Bristolians walked, students marched, and the story ran in newspapers across the country. The pressure held. The company surrendered on the 28th of August, 1963, the very day across the ocean, Martin Luther King stood in Washington and described his dream. Let that coincidence land for a second. Within 2 years, Britain had its first Race Relations Act, and the road to it ran through Bristol's bus stops. 7 years later, the city got its heart back. In 1970, the rusted shell of Brunel's Great Britain was patched, floated onto a pontoon, and towed 8,000 miles home from the Falklands. On the 19th of July, she is coming up the Avon on the tide, and 100,000 people line the gorge to watch her pass beneath the Clifton Suspension Bridge, finished by Brunel's friends after he was gone, as his memorial. His first great dream salutes his last. There is film of that moment, and I defy you to watch it unmoved. She rests today in the very dry dock where she was built, masts back up, visitors on her decks, the single most visited place in the city. Bristol, it turns out, has a habit of bringing its giants home. The city's aircraft works at Filton had built fighters and airliners for half a century, and then built Concorde, the supersonic beauty whose British prototype first flew from Filton's runway in 1969. She crossed the Atlantic in under 3 hours, twice the speed of sound, with Bristol-built engines and wings. In 2003, the last Concorde ever to fly touched down on that same Filton runway, home to stay, and in 2017, the city opened Aerospace Bristol around her. The late century found the city speaking in new voices, the slow, smoky, late-night records of Portishead, Tricky, and the trip-hop crews drifting out of basement studios. The world filed it all under the Bristol sound. The animators at Ardman sculpting Wallace and Gromit out of Bristol clay and carrying home a shelf of Academy Awards. The city later filled its streets with giant painted Gromit statues that raised millions for the Children's Hospital. And, on walls around town, sharp stenciled images signed by a local nobody knew, called Banksy, who became the most famous anonymous artist on earth while his home city pretended not to be proud. Every August since 1979, hot air balloons, many stitched together right here in the workshops of the world's leading maker of them, rise over the gorge at dawn in their hundreds, the burners roaring like dragons clearing their throats. The statue from 1895 was still standing in the middle of it all. On the 7th of June, 2020, as protests over racial injustice swept the world, a Bristol crowd put ropes around Edward Colston, brought him down, rolled him through the streets his wealth had built, and tipped him into the harbour his ships had sailed from, a few steps from a footbridge named for Pero, an enslaved man who lived here. The image went around the planet in an hour. The city fished the statue out 4 days later and made a decision I find genuinely wise. Not to restore him and not to hide him, but to lay him in a museum, still paint-splashed, lying on his back beside the placards, the argument itself preserved. The concert hall that bore his name became the Bristol Beacon. Bristol in 2026 is 500,000 people who agree on almost nothing and seem to like it that way. A city that, in 2022, voted to abolish the job of its own mayor, possibly the most Bristol decision ever taken. It was crowned Europe's Green Capital in 2015, the first British city ever chosen, and the largest regeneration project in its history is now rising around Brunel's old station. The Matthew still sails, the Great Britain still gleams in her dock, the balloons still climb the dawn, and you, with a chocolate bar in the cupboard, ship-shape on your tongue, and a debt paid on the nail, have been carrying this city around with you all along. We are the crew behind Edward Resurrect's history, and hauling 1,000 years of Bristol back up the river has been a proper joy. This city never agreed on anything, so keep its tradition going. Tell us which of its gifts you would defend the loudest: the bridge, the bar, the boycott, the ship that came home, and which lost harbour of history we should sail into after this. Subscribe, and we will hold your place on deck. Twice a day the tide walks out on Bristol. Twice a day, like everything this city ever launched, it comes back home.